for, for people to buy in. So it's absolutely your responsibility to make sure that you are going into the schools that most need prevention services. Most need prevention services. Not the one that's easiest, the one where the most need is there. That you use the HT risk assessment tool to understand if youth are at risk there. And if you're at the decision-making table, it is absolutely your responsibility to ask questions and to steer decision makers to respond to youth at risk. And, you know, I don't care if you use the curriculum that we're developing, if you use the My Life, My Choice is a great curriculum, for example, doesn't matter. The most important thing is that you use that assessment tool, that trafficking tool, to look at whatever is coming across that table at that school system or wherever, and take out your tool and put it next to that curriculum and go through it and see if you are choosing the best curriculum. You know, I said it yesterday. If you have a chance to sit at those tables, ever, it is absolutely your responsibility to speak up. That's the reason you're at the table. So when they start to adopt something that's watered down, something that doesn't identify at-risk kids, you need to get yourself, your ego, your shyness, your whatever the hell it is, out of the way and speak up. Don't come to that table and be silent. Don't take that chair and be silent, because kids' lives are depending on you showing up, standing up, speaking up. Any questions? Yes. Yeah. She said, how do you get involved in local activities and anti-trafficking activities? In a lot of cities across the US, there are anti-trafficking coalitions. And usually they're open to the community. So you go there, you sit there. I suggest you sit there for a few meetings, learn the lay of the land, because, you know, you have to be invited to the sandbox to play. You know how that works. And absolutely do not go in there and say, now, I've been here to one meeting. Here's what you people need to do. That's not going to go over well. So, you know, you have to go in, you have to sit humbly, you have to learn the lay of the land, then you have to build relationship and trust. Then you start saying things like, hey, do we have a curriculum? Hey, do our local schools have a curriculum? Well, where is it? Well, who's doing it? Well, what, can we get one? Hey, I actually have a tool where we can measure if it's a good one. You know, and then you start to offer those things that you can offer. If you don't have a coalition in your community, you can always start one. And I know that sounds scary, but let me tell you how to do it. You say, is human trafficking a passion of mine? Yes, it is. And then you go to a friend and you say, is it a passion of yours? Yes, it is. Let's have a meeting. Who's not at this meeting that needs to be here? Let's go get them. Then you go from a meeting to a group. The group says, is there anybody strategically we need at this meeting? Then the group goes out and gets them. Now you went from a group to a community. When you develop a strategy, you move from a community to a movement. You don't have to be smart. You don't have to know everything. You have to be smart in one area, and that is to allow the talent in the room and allow the talent to do what it does best. Yeah, Amy. Yes. So in Ohio, you can go to humantraffickingohio.gov. Oh, humantrafficking.ohio.gov. So if you're in Ohio, you can do that. Whatever state you come from, Google it and find out if there's something going on in your community as well. Yes, sir.
One piece I think that I'm getting from your presentation is the idea of breaking the barriers of institutional privilege. And I think once you can break the barriers of institutional privilege, then you can go even deeper, into the issue. Because the reason why we probably spend money on programs that aren't worth it is because of institutional privilege. And
Yes.
if we can break those barriers in terms of who gets those privileges on an institutional basis,
Yes.
then you have something different to talk about.
Absolutely.
A problem is a problem depending on whose kids are being affected.
Yes.
Not that we didn't have opiate problems a long time ago,
Yes.
but because who it's hitting.
Hmm.
The old adage of, how do we define a social problem, or who defines it?
Yes. So he says once we focus on institutional privilege and who defines the problem, then we can start addressing, we can go deeper. And so that is our social justice call. Yeah, I agree. Yes, ma'am. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so she says, is there any kind of organization that is focused on, like, is it like vetting you know, the curricula, housing the curricula, understanding the curricula, and not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. There might be, is anybody aware of any? Yeah. Yeah, I love that. That's a great vision. Because she says it's through the CDC, and I wonder, I haven't seen anything through the Center for Disease Control, but that would be an excellent, um, yeah. I'm going to DC so Monday, so I'm gonna bring that up. That's a good idea. What's your name? Robin? I'm gonna say Robin said. Yes, yes. Any other questions? Yes. Thank you. Yeah, so she says, have you ever collaborated with the United Nations? I have not, but um, you're the celebrity in the room on that, and so I'm going to connect with you. That's what's going to happen. And then we can be on our way. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much. Please go forward and use the tools. Also, I forgot to mention, there's some information in the back. There's a reference list that people just love, like we have reference lists on all the risk factors and where to get articles. There's a report on the statistics we ran with the 54 kids, if you're like big into statistical data. So lots of information back there you can take with you. Thank you.
a dual role. I'm actually the room moderator and I'm actually the presenter today. so I'll give you some housekeeping things. Okay, the blue sheet, keep this, and this is your evaluation on the actual conference itself. So you're gonna hold this till the end of the day. Make sure you turn that in. And this is your evaluation form. They should be on the seats. Please make sure that you fill these out. And then Courtney, she's gonna be the collector of those. Then I'm also going to be the one that gives you your CEU number at the end. Okay, well, I am Pat Stevens, and you are in the class of Human Trafficking and Individuals with Developmental Disabilities. I'm a director at the Lucas County Board of Developmental Disabilities. I've been there 22 years, actually servicing our individuals. Right now, I'm currently over 450 providers that serve our individuals in the community, and I'm also over the Major and Unusual Incident Department. I actually became a part of the Human Trafficking Coalition several years ago, and then also we run a PATH project, which is from the University of Toledo's Human Trafficking Social Justice Institute, and we actually are the only DD agency with a PATH coordinator that is dropped inside of our agency out of all 50 states. And so my co-partner is Steve Mentrick. Actually, Steve used to work for me, and then he decided to leave me. But he's a
She can't get me away, though.
So he's a program director of Bittersweet Farms. He has a master's in recreation and therapy and leisure administration and 15 years experience in the DD field. Steve is involved with assisting victims of trafficking to feel safe, remove barriers, and identifies limitations. And also another strange thing about the two of us, we actually graduated from the same college, which is really interesting. But the thing is that we really look at how well do we take care of our individuals with developmental disabilities. Number one, they're like the highest population right now with vulnerabilities. A lot of our DD individuals on learning disabilities, they are a target for your traffickers. And then plus some of our individuals, unfortunately, they're very accustomed to sexual abuse. They're running at about 87% of them had some form of sexual abuse somewhere in their lifetime. Okay.
And this I always like to open up with, too. The way we got involved with this wasn't a traditional way. We didn't plan to be involved. We didn't know we were getting involved to support a victim with a trafficking issue. We kind of Pat started attending meetings through the local coalition here and learned about the issue of trafficking. From that, we brought it back to the board, and I'm sitting in a team meeting with her, and we're talking about we need to start learning. We need to start looking at this issue and recognizing how is it impacting the field we work in the disability field. 2 hours later, we had our first victim coming into a case management conference to talk to, and she had stated that she was being forced to sleep with people and did not want to do it anymore. So from that response, it was trial by fire. We had no opportunity to train, learn all the ins and outs. We had to just jump in and kind of take care of business. Because of that, we found a number of barriers from the typical supports that exist for victims of trafficking that don't necessarily support the victims with developmental disabilities in the best way. We also saw barriers and issues with the systems that we worked for that created a bigger challenge of getting supports for those in a need that was health and safety oriented. So because of that, we said we don't want everybody else to have to go through these same trials and hit the same barriers and take as many risks as we had to. So we come out and try and make it our effort to present to county boards, staff across the state of Ohio that work in the disability system to, one, make them aware of what to look for, the issues and concerns, but then also prepare them for rapid response, because as we all know, keeping somebody involved in one of these situations is a high risk. And the best thing we can do is help them get the supports they need and work with the variety of systems that exist.
Okay, what we're going to cover first are just some risks that we have. There's a lot of risk factors for individuals with developmental disabilities, and a lot of it's exploitation, manipulation, and victimization. There are a lot of social barriers for our individuals due to a lack of natural relationships, often isolated with individuals with DD. Because something as our system, what we have done, unfortunately, because we have always been traditional services, our traditional services is to protect health and safety. So from that, what you do is you begin to isolate them anyway. Not that it was ever our intention, but it did happen. Sometimes the schools are failing to accommodate the students, because what we're noticing, I'll say over the past few years, our population is definitely changing. They could walk in a room and you would never even know it was a person with a developmental disability. So with the population changing, they're more community-based. So there's a lot of other things they can get into because of that. So some will drop out of school, and there's always just, they feel that there are limited options for their futures. And then
I want to add to that too. The other piece where I feel a lot of times schools often may fail, the system fails. How many of you work with youth in a school system? Few, okay. In schools, they have IEPs for students with disabilities and learning needs, okay? And within those IEPs, they identify the goals for achieving independence and curriculums and those types of supports needed so they could be successful in school. The problem that we see with the system is that in special education, sex education is not mandated as a curriculum needed for individuals with disabilities. So right now, we're not educating our population that we're here to support to be proactive and, one, understand what's going on in a sexual relationship, what's healthy, what's appropriate. And without that proper education, how can they understand what to call it sometimes? Maybe love can come in many forms, we know. So if we don't educate on what's appropriate, what is okay to give of yourself, what is okay to make it an appropriate relationship, how can we expect them to call it what it is and then reach out for help when needed? There are so many barriers in, like we said, the communication. If I don't know what it is and I don't know how to express that to you, how can I get help? We have to be the decoders in that situation, and we have to understand the people, but how do we get proactive? We need to step up in the education system, I think, absolutely, with the special education department and starting those conversations early on. Because without it, we're always going to have an uphill battle of waiting until there's an incident and then going forward with helping and supporting.
And recently, we've been doing a lot of parent mentor groups in order to get the parents on board so we can start getting the information in IEPs. Because we're looking at the learning disabilities also, because that's an area right now that's very uncovered, because there's no one really dealing with that population at all. But they're like common views. That's why I was saying that our individuals change, that people don't think that DD individuals are sexually active. So as a result of sexual education and relationship expectations, those are rarely explored. Well, I hate to tell you, I have a sister who's DD. She's my oldest sister. There's 2 boys and 2 girls. We're a common view family, very common view. What I mean by that is we didn't think our sister was sexually active. Me and my sister one day, we were talking, and she says, I wonder if Mom and Dad ever talked to her about some sexual issues. And we're like looking at each other going, well, I don't know. I know they talked to us about it, but I'm sure they probably may not have talked to her because we had that view that she would never be sexually active. So my sister is 69, and she's had boyfriends periodically. And so my brothers were very, very protective, as well as the rest of our family, because we've always provided natural support services to her. She actually just engaged the DD system when she was about 65. And that's because there was a program she wanted to be into. So as my sister and I continued to have this conversation, and I said, well, you know why? I don't think she ever did. And she said, well, I don't think she ever did either. And I very politely looked at her and said, well, she kind of is pretty much very high functioning. I said, and if we asked her, she's probably going to look at both of us and tell us, I think you need to mind your own business. So that is why we never asked. But like I said, we were a common view family. That is something we never thought of when it pertained to her, that sexual relationships. We just never thought about that. And my 2 brothers, I don't think they did very well with that either. So, no.
And that's something, too, that I think as a system, there's always those health and safety concerns and other services for daily living that become the priority. That this extra effort, this extra education piece, and that extra conversation, it's often the low man on the totem pole. But with community integration and helping to build people's access to what's available in the community and their independence in the community, it's the only thing we can do to help prevent further issues once they get out there. Education is the #1 asset in this realm. So the risk factors for those with developmental disabilities, you see them here. A lot of them look similar to what we may see in a typical trafficking victim, where there is some social powerlessness, where They don't have the information of who to go to, what to say, what to call it. Maybe a fear of dealing with people with authority based off of their past traumas, because as Pat said, trauma, abuse, and those things, those are unfortunately a common thing in the field of developmental disabilities. Many people experience that at a young age, which then starts that kind of desensitization and being okay with things that aren't necessarily appropriate. Communication skill deficits. It's almost like speaking a foreign language sometimes in a region that you don't understand what's being asked of you. You don't understand what to call it. So again, getting the help you need and being specific. We have studies from the Disability Rights Ohio from 2015 where they did surveys. And within that survey, they identified the high rate of sexual abuse and sexual neglect that occurs within the disability system. From that, the way I like to say it is, when we see it on those numbers, it's an 87% of the population has experienced it at one point or another. And I choke up a little bit about it because that's disheartening. When, as a typical community, it's in the 20%, 30% range sometimes that we're seeing that. But when you see 80+% of the people experiencing this in their life, it's not hard to believe why they may rationalize, why they may understand that this might be okay or accept something as being okay because of their past experiences. They also have a diminished ability to protect oneself due to lack of instruction and or resources. Reaching out to the police can be fearful for anyone, especially if the only times you've interacted with them was in emergency situations and you didn't have that proactive education of how to reach out for help. Two, our system that we work for that helps to provide the supports for people with disabilities is extremely complex. It has so many different avenues to it and barriers for our services sometimes that we have to help navigate. Somebody with a disability that struggles with understanding how to navigate those would limit themselves to the resources just through to a lack of knowledge. They also have a diminished ability to detect who's safe to be around. How many work in the disability field or have? Okay, a good number. So you guys will all be able to relate to this. How many have seen their individual service plans, the person-centered plans that help coordinate the services? Within those plans, how many have seen a priority goal from the person being about forming a relationship with somebody, boyfriend, girlfriend, getting married one day, or having a family? Raise the hands. Those are the statements, when you see the high priority in those plans of those statements, they're willing to accept relationships for what they are, a relationship. Not understanding what the give and take is in a relationship. They just want that feeling of being needed and loved, and will sometimes do what it takes, not understanding that what I have to do for love today is not really love and I'm being used. As long as the person there that's their boyfriend, their girlfriend, in the relationship with is showing them an ounce of interest, that could be enough to convince these individuals that they do have their best interest. And that's what we have a big struggle against, is how do we help them understand those barriers? How do we understand that? And again, my answer always goes to education. Pat and I are really working hard to connect with advocacy groups across the state to start educating on these different sexual relationship trainings. This way we're able to better support them and help them be prepared as we move forward in life.
Okay, here are some other risk factors. Due to discrimination and exclusion and common in many places pertains to DD and mental health, because we don't only deal with DD population, we also have dual diagnosis also. Those cases are very tough to work with periodically because you really would like to have our agency and mental health work together, and there are times we do and there are times that we don't. The government at one point, I don't think they recognized at first the DD population could be at risk, so there have been a lot of effort going forward so that we can get them involved. And so right now, I think it was last year, Pilar's project actually started adding the DD actual numbers to some of their figures, which that was kind of a little victory on our side. So there's stigmas, marginalization of the DD population, which creates particular vulnerabilities. They're a vulnerable group already as it is. And then it's difficult to acquire. Human trafficking, our numbers are very difficult to acquire. And see, the reason why we dropped the PATH coordinator at our agency is because we're tracking at the same time. So we'll actually do intakes, particularly that deal with a girl that may have a learning disability or has a developmental disability. So we're able to at least track numbers a little bit better now. And then the other thing is they look at our individuals as being people who are not deemed competent enough to be witnesses. And this is why we are used, and we have our system, the DD system, as interpreters. We are their voice when things are happening. That's why we're their advocates. Because there are times they can't describe what's happening. We may be able to say it in a different way than they can. And what I'm going to do is have Steve talk a little bit about our first case. And the reason why I'm going to do that, because there was definitely a language and a communication barrier with this young female, because she really did not understand the questions from an agency when they were given to her. So Steve, you want to talk about her a little bit?
So like I had mentioned, the first victim we had worked with mentioned in a meeting that this was what she did not want. So we had an immediate response that we had to get her some health and safety protection. So option number one, when you don't know what else exists, is domestic violence shelter. We have to find that. Okay, first things first, at a domestic violence shelter, there's an assessment and an intake. Within that assessment and intake, there's very specific questions and criteria that you have to then be admitted into having housing there. One of those questions was, when was the last time you were sexually abused? The young lady looked at the assessor when she said that like she had two heads and said, never, what are you talking about? So I thought back to the conversation we had in the office before we went to the domestic violence shelter. What she described was the situation of what happened when she was being trafficked to people to sleep with. She would say they would blindfold me, they'd tie my hands behind my back, put me in the back seat of the car, we'd drive for an hour, get dropped off at a garage, I would service men for a number of hours, and then be sent back in the same manner to get home. So when I heard that and saw her response in that assessment, and this just clicked in my head, it was a lucky stride, I said, when was the last time you were blindfolded? Oh, yesterday. Quickly, she responded to yesterday. She wasn't equating her situation to being sexual abuse. She didn't know what sexual abuse meant. She said in her head it sounded bad, so no, I don't want to be a part of it. But when it came to the reality, when you were last blindfolded or tied up, and the things that then happened after that, that's the sexual abuse, but she didn't understand it that way. So for us in the system, and when you're working with somebody with a developmental disability, it is so important to have active listening. You have to be able to hear the individual's story. It might not be specifically detail-oriented to time frames and this and that, and that's why that competency piece ends up, because their time frame may be off. Something that happened last week could have been seen as something that happened months ago to them. So the descriptions may not be accurate. What we have to do is decode those conversations. We have to hear what they're trying to tell us, interpret it, and then provide that to the people as we move forward for support and resources and convictions of those who are offending in the situation. Without that, they could be powerless. And to be powerless in one of these situations is not ever going to end in a good scenario. It's only going to put this victim longer in a situation that they drastically do not want to be a part of but don't know how to get out of.
And normally our population is serviced about 45 times in a day, because they figure they're not capable of even discussing that or feeling
Question
pain.
over here. Oh. This is another problem. I'm really happy you asked that question, because this is I'll be honest, how we got her to say it, we were lucky. We were lucky we did nothing other than be present to help her with an original request. This is the problem where I was glad you pointed out, because I had to bring this in. How this young lady got involved with our system was she had a friend In our system, it's a natural support. We get really excited because that's a service you don't have to pay for in the ISP or the waiver system. So this natural support who had an apartment, let her stay there, made sure she made it to her appointments, got signed off on releases of information at every organization she was tied to. They came to us because Social Security was withholding her monthly statement, and they would not reassign it to an individual. They would only release those funds to an agency because her payee in our field changed 5 times over the course of a year and a half. So that was her saving grace. A system saying, stop, we're not releasing it to another individual. The people who were controlling her, that natural support, she was a part of the exploitation. She was a part of the young lady getting put into this situation. She was after the extra paycheck, basically, that you don't have to send anybody out to work for, but we get a monthly statement with extra funds. So in this field, predators realize the benefit systems that exist for those with disabilities. There is more incentive now because not only when you're working and I'm exploiting you on the streets, I also have the opportunity to make money off your monthly benefits. I also can get access to HUD housing through you as a person, to have more opportunities spread out across the community. It is a network that, as much good as we put into helping protect these individuals, these network of people are putting in that same energy and effort to manipulate it. And there's incentives. Because again, we know that trafficking is a low risk, high reward problem that we have. The low risk side of this is even lower because of the lack of being able to reach out for help, the lack of being able to advocate for what's going on in your life. So to say there's a trick to getting somebody to admit to it, I don't know. We got lucky. We got lucky in the situation. The scenario helped us to be there and say, no, we can't release the funding. And she had some situations that came up over that course of time that said, I need to say something because if I don't, I'm in trouble. And that was our luck. So again, persons with disabilities, they're always more likely to be victims of violence or rape. A British study had shown that police intervention, legal protection, and preventative care for women and girls with disabilities, they're just extremely vulnerable to this type of abuse for all of these different reasons. The surveys of people out there internationally show that 25% of women with intellectual disabilities have been raped, and 6% of women with disabilities have been forcibly sterilized internationally. So again, people with disabilities have oftentimes historically had a lack of choice and options in what goes on in their life. Yes, the systems are pushing further for independence and realizing that people are people, we just have to do things a little differently sometimes. But these still traditional viewpoints of controlling them and taking advantage of them still exist out there.
Okay, signs of trafficking for those with disabilities: prior abuse at home, which is very similar to other actual victims, including sexual abuse, which we had talked about. You could have a lot of involvement with like your children's service boards, so you may have different cases on them. Living at home with both parents who are abusing drugs. We're starting to see a lot more of this happening. We haven't had the pleasure to have to deal with that, but we are now, because we are having parents that have on opioids that have kids that are disabled. Because we have a lot of kids that are coming into our system, and they're coming in because of the opioid abuse. And then just running away from home. And a lot of times if we're looking at runaways, if someone keeps running away from home and you keep taking them back, start really thinking about why are they doing that? Something's not meshing here. So start asking some questions. And then, like I said, drug usage. And the girls that we have, what they usually will have is like 3 or 4 phones, cell phones. So we kind of look at that as like a precursor for us, because why would she need that many cell phones? So it isn't about change of clothing and accessories or money with them, is that they will have more than one cell phone. So that's kind of a red flag for us, because most of the females that we have dealt with, they usually average about 3 phones on them, and that's for who's calling for services. So one's for the trafficker, the other one is they're actually for services. So that's why that's a cue for us, which it may not be a cue for other victims, but that is one for us.
So there have not been a lot of studies on the impact of human trafficking with individuals with disabilities, and Lucas County is pretty much the only county that's been actively involved with getting the PATHS coordinator program involved to really move forward supporting. Pat and I have led an effort to go across the state of Ohio over the past 3 years now, presenting on this information and really getting more specific with the county boards on rapid response, how to coordinate the local and state resources to intervene and assist people with moving forward. One of the big things, like we said, domestic violence shelters are fantastic for immediate response, but they have a lot of expectations of independence there. Because of that, some of our individuals may not be able to manage their own money, cook for themselves, figure out transportation around town on their own. Those are all expectations that you need to be independent with when you go to a domestic violence shelter often. So because of that, it was a good first resource for emergency, but it wasn't one that we could work with continuously, which has then had us have to reach out to the provider networks. Within the provider systems, they have programs and organizations that provide homemaker personal care support, basically in-home support for your daily needs, transportation, and those things. We have had to work with training different provider programs on the supports that are required for these individuals, because it's different than the typical person with a disability. We have to apply what they call rights restrictions. With Pat and her role at the county board, she oversees the Major Unusual Incident Department. That is where we put together information about incidents that occur that are damaging the person, and then also what do we do in response to those. So her authority gives us some little extra leverage sometimes.
Because what we usually will do is there's rights violations, so that's an MUI. So I started doing rights violations all over the place with our actual individuals with DD, because I do violate their rights if we get a case. There's no phones, no TVs, no internet, no types of electronics, no landline use. There's a reason for that. Somehow when you have a female with a disability that gets involved, she wants to go back to what she's more comfortable with. So our preference is that none of that should be used, because not unless you want to traffic her or any of their people who don't want her off the street visiting your provider agency. So that is why we cut off anything that's electronic for them, because they will use it. And we've had some of the females that we have. One of them, we have like safe houses or safe actual places we will put them. She's walking down the hall, she's talking to two of her cousins, and we're like, nope, bad place, we'll shift and move her someplace else, because we have to really be careful where we place them for safety. And so, like I said, the rights violations, they agreed with me at our actual DODD MUI unit. They don't mind if I actually do rights violations, because we technically cannot take things away from our individuals. But we do it now, and do it quite comfortably, so. And like I said, an oversight of 450 providers. We have our providers, they come in for annual days. We usually have about 80 of them that come in once a month. And I'm in there actually talking to them about respite housing, where they want to be involved in serving females that actually have been trafficked. So I have a few of them that they're calling, and they do want to be involved. It's very difficult because a lot of times, like I said, the girls will jump and run away because that's just not a natural setting for them. So we need to make sure we have someone who has actually worked with either kids that have been sexually abused or adults that have been sexually abused. And the ones that we do have, it seems like they're working out pretty well.
So this next slide talks about the individuals with developmental disabilities and who they've been sexually abused by. This list is very common for those that have been sexually abused without disabilities, but the one thing I like to point out is you have this section right in the center. These are the people that are paired with providing support services to the individuals, and unfortunately, this has occurred in that realm too. Those that you are hiring to pay and protect those individuals, it has occurred there. So the reason I like to point those out is because individuals with disabilities depend on other people to be independent sometimes. And with that, they're putting a lot of trust, a lot of faith that those coming in to support them have their best interest in mind. And when they don't, that's what can create some major issues, major problems for them, because on day one, I'm trusting you with some of the most intimate portions of my life, whether it's helping me in the bathroom, helping me with my medications, helping me with my cooking or cleaning. And then you have situations like this that can occur. So it is expansive because of that social isolation, because of the lack of network of other people who aren't in their life sometimes. Our goal is always to connect people to a network of people that have their best interests in mind, help to connect through the community, not isolate. This should never create a fear-based response of keeping people with disabilities out of risk. It's how do we do a better job connecting them to those in the community like you or I maybe had growing up to feel supported and feel safe when going out into the community to access and benefit from everything it has to offer.
And if you look at the research numbers, you're looking at 97 to 99% abuse is known by someone that our individuals trust. And that's pretty high. And if you feel that an individual's in immediate danger, no different than a regular victim, call the police. But in our system, what you normally would do is call one of our MUI unit investigators. Is I have a team of 12 IAs, is what we call them. They're investigative agents, and they're the ones that would take these cases. And if they think a case needs to have law enforcement involved, they will call. And they know already to actually violate their rights on certain things because it's something that we work on well. So our IAs are very well trained when it comes to actual human traffic case. Usually they're bringing to me possible traffickers' names. Then I work with the FBI task force here, and I'll give them the names. And there are some guys that our actual individuals have been exposed to that have been pretty dangerous, actual traffickers. And then you can call our Board of DD, and like I said, and that's our units. And you actually, when you file the report, you don't even have to have any proof, because we're always going to sit there and gauge it on a percentage of whether or not it's going to be substantiated or unsubstantiated.
I do want to add to that too. A lot of times those red flags, those kind of, I don't have proof, but I suspect something, forces us as a system to do kind of like a history trail. So we'll go back through case management notes, CSB records, things like that, to really build a full picture of what this person's experienced throughout their life to see if there are any red flags that have gone unnoticed by somebody. We did that with one of the victims. After we really got involved and started working forward, we saw some red flags on a report where a young lady had an accusation in a case note of being raped in her neighborhood, but not involved, the family didn't involve law enforcement or the police. So immediately when I kind of saw that, because we were just doing some demographics, looking in a zip code at the age range and saw that, I was like, this just doesn't feel right. So we started asking more questions, got to the case manager who actually took the notes, got some clarifications, and when we reached out, we did find she was being prepared to be exploited. In her basement, I think it was either her stepdad or her uncle had a stripper pole set up. He was taking videos, putting on the internet of her, preparing her basically for what he was going to do next. And because of that, we were able to respond and react in an appropriate way that got her to a point of safety. But it took the time of looking for something and then being willing to ask those really uncomfortable questions afterwards and wait for the response that we get. Again, we're interpreting, we're listening, we're trying to figure it out so that we can help you get to safety.
And a lot of, all of us at our agency, in which in social services, we're all mandated reporters, so if we see things, we do have to report them. And I'm one of the types of people, if I have one suspicion, a thought, or I'm thinking, I tell. I'm calling someone. I may be wrong, but I'd rather be wrong. But usually I will tell. I just don't slide past that. And then one thing that, when Steve moved the slide, there's something that we even had to deal with in our own system. And what that had to deal with MUIs, they didn't call any of it trafficking. You would look at it from the aspect of an investigation of sexual abuse, sexual assault, or other matters is what it was looking like. So they didn't specifically ever really know what we were looking at until we started getting some cases. So once we started getting cases, that's when we started to delineate whether or not it actually was sexual abuse or really is it trafficking. Yes.
Do you see the same type of instances in, say, forced labor? Because, I know you said it's not just about sex, right?
No.
No.
It's labor too.
Absolutely.
Yes.
All right. Can I go on to this tangent?
Yes.
No.
And he's going to go on a
I
tangent
love
on
this
this
one.
one because,
All right.
well, our system has changed, so
Yes.
CMS, who controls everything that we always do, decides that we want to have community integration and inclusion. Now you're on, Steve.
All right. So labor trafficking in our field, it is prevalent. It is something that exists. One reference I want to give everybody that you could take home and watch the video, The Men of Atalissa.
Yes.
It's a little documentary, short documentary about a turkey farm that utilized the subcontract to have individuals with disabilities work in their processing plant, and their story and outcome, it's Men of Atalissa. Atalissa. Watch it. It does a lot more to this conversation than I can because it gives you an example. But in our realm, employment first in the state of Ohio is a huge push right now where everybody is expected to have employment. Fantastic goal, fantastic effort. I stand behind it. Problems that I see existing or coming of that is there's a spectrum of services that exist with attaining that employment, and some of it is volunteering and training opportunities. This is where I see that if our system does not monitor what's going on under volunteering and training, we could have people stuck in training their entire life. And is that training providing a profit for some organization or some person personally? That's what I feel we need to monitor, because across the state of Ohio with the agricultural community and with the other hospitality services, we've seen individuals exploited, both international victims as well as victims with developmental disabilities. So those areas, it's not as prevalent because of how, not that it's not as prevalent, it's not identified as much because of how difficult it is to prove and see those situations for what they truly are. But I do want our system, we've challenged from the state level down, that with employment first, if we're not monitoring what's going on with these training and volunteer opportunities, they will slowly take the curve of exploitation, and that's not the intention of employment first. So it's great for the push to the community, but we have to be standing behind watching and making sure that the work is truly being training and that somebody has an opportunity to move on from that training eventually to a paid employment opportunity. And that's a big passion of mine, because part of my role in my current organization I work for is to oversee our day program and training opportunities that we have. And it can be a very fine line and gray area sometimes, but as long as you're pushing in the best interest of seeing an individual grow out of needing my service, then I can say that we're doing the right efforts. I'm nervous about those that don't have those same intentions, though. Yes.
I'm just curious, keep referring to gender as in she, which certainly the number of individuals who have been exploited are going to be proportionate more to the female side. Just curious to know if you have male individuals with whom you have also experienced.
Yes, we do, and the males are very hard to work with, because we have a case right now, we've been monitoring it for about maybe 5 months, and it's a gentleman, him and his mom both use cocaine, and so she sells them for the drugs, so she traffics him for that. But one thing about him, he loves his mother, so we cannot even get him to commit that's actually really what's happening, even though it's like everything there, they're red flags galore, but he will not. He'll tell you that she will use him for sex, for drugs. He doesn't mind, because they're heavily into cocaine. But he's just like, nope, I'm going to do what I need to do for my mom and myself. And so they're very, very hard and difficult to work with, the males. And then some of our other males that we have, to them it's very comfortable that they're being flown all over the United States for sexual purposes. And so those are the cases I get calls on quite a bit. What am I going to do with that situation? I said the best thing you can do is educate, educate, and educate, and get a safety plan put in place, because if something happens, I want you to at least make sure that that individual can get themselves out of there if they need be. And that's even if it's your card, you call the police, pick them up wherever they are. But the fellows are very, very hard to work with, because they're not going to be as forthright as the females.
And most of our experience has been more on the female end with sex trafficking, which is why we kind of have a little bias with the amount we talk about it in the conversation. The labor trafficking is just as prevalent, and it's just not as noticed. That's where I feel like we have to really do a better job as a system monitoring that. So like I said before, some of the victim accommodations and experiences, the differences, that assessment and questioning, active listening, that is our role to support these individuals. Talking in language that makes sense to them will help us better understand the story and situation. The immediate support needs, like we said, when you go to a domestic violence shelter, there's many levels of independence that you need to have. So we have to have a full picture of what are the individual needs and what's the environment that's going to best suit this person. Some that are very independent could be successful in a domestic violence shelter temporarily. Others, though, that maybe have different support needs, like this one young lady we worked with, she had a very low comprehension. I mean, we're talking about possibly, I think it was a 44 IQ. So her concrete understanding of things around her was very, very skewed. To get her to rationalize things and understand what we were doing and to see any success in a shelter, that was not possible because of her amount of need. So what we had to do was coordinate even outside of our system. We worked with a program out of Tiffin area, the sisters, the nuns down in Tiffin, they have a convent that runs a program down there. And they opened their doors for the first time to an individual with disability through us. We had to talk to them saying, we don't know where else to go. We're scared for her supports. The involvement of the family and other people from that network were very intimidating, to say the least. So we knew we had to get out of the area, and our system of transferring from county to county and record sharing, that has a process. So we had an emergency. We couldn't wait on a process. So these women opened their doors willingly and saw that they can help and provide support with very little accommodations and training, and it was a huge success. So it's the resourcefulness of those that are within the system. You can count on it for certain things, but you also got to get creative and reach outside that box a lot of the times as well. The crisis support options through the county boards, a lot of the times that's funding related. The county board doesn't necessarily provide direct support, but they will coordinate the funding that pays for the people that come in and provide those services. The nice thing about this is a pot of money that typical victims of trafficking that don't have a developmental disability will not have access to. So if you have a victim with a disability, there's two sets of resources that are here to help pay for those services, because the advanced needs of these individuals, it's going to take a lot more to help them get to a recovery stance. It's going to take a lot more counseling. It's going to take a lot more immediate trauma support for these individuals to start moving forward. So benefits from having access to both systems is key to their success.
He did that so nicely. I'm proud of him.
I usually vent a lot about this
He usually
one.
vents about this the most because, you know, all 88 counties can do intakes different ways. So it could block your system from moving someone to another county. And like I said, he was very nice to you all, because I think how many assessments did we have to have done in psychologicals to get a person out of our county?
I think we had to approach at least 8 counties before we had a transfer of services for this young lady, and it took about, I want to say, a little over 8 to 9 months. 8 to 9 months of hitting roadblocks, while the whole time we have a young lady in limbo, being moved from place to place to keep her healthy and safe. And it wasn't because we didn't want to get her to the right place. It was because the system set up some barriers for each individual county to say, I don't think we're ready to support that. And they did it not by saying that directly, obviously, because that would just be absurd in the social work field, but they used the paperwork as the barrier.
Yes.
The paperwork of, oh, her eligibility documentation of that IQ, that was back when she was 9 years old. She's 23 right now. That documentation's out of date. Well, that documentation said she had a 54 IQ at that time. If you do the science behind it, IQs raise or lower generally 10 points. So if you put her up 10 points, she's still within range to receive services. And that's if she had a successful, supportive life where she could grow and develop these skills. Meanwhile, she's been traumatized since the age of 3, exploited from the age of 13, 14 years old, and she's now in her 20s. Do you think that she grew developmentally at all, or was hindered? Yeah. So for any system to put up a roadblock saying that maybe she's not qualified for our services, to me was insanity. And we cannot allow bureaucracy to stand in the way of getting somebody to where they need to be health and safety-wise, period.
Yeah. And that's why the both of us at times are a pain to our system. And what we were smart enough to do, which we really are blessed to have superintendents, and we had our superintendents are real active when it comes to this, and so she picks up a phone and says, okay, here's the situation. I really need to get this person there. Something happened to one of yours, you can send them here. So, because you know they'll be in good hands. So there's these conversations that they have. And what I usually will do is do a courtesy call. If we have an individual that goes into somebody else's county, I will call them, talk to the superintendent there, and let them know we have a person in your county. They're there because it's going to be the safe haven for them from trafficking. I said, and the one thing is we will have our actual SASs, which are Service and Support Administrators, or I'll have my PATH coordinators on that case. So no matter where it is, we're traveling to monitor that case. But like I said, but it could be very taxing at times, but they're getting it because we've trained about 45 different counties so far, and we're getting phone calls, a lot of them lately, in reference to how to put some protocols in place for situations. But your own system can beat you up, and like I said, we can be pains too because of that.
You had a question?
Mm-hmm. 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 Correct.
When it comes to the victims that we've worked with that are fairly independent, we can work with local tax dollars as an emergency response because those are only at the discretion of the local county board's usage, and they're not dictated by state and Medicaid dollars. So it's kind of looking at a different pot of money locally to then empower the local providers to open up that door to the person based off the risk at hand. I don't want to say anything about when it comes to proactive, preventative measures in advance. It's probably only going to be crisis intervention that they would apply those to, where you're actually in the midst of a situation because they are local tax dollars and they have to answer to the taxpayers. But it is there and available for those immediate responses. Yes, and that takes a lot of advocacy from the people that are involved with the case and presenting to the upper administration as well as superintendents and justifying the need. Justifying the need for those funds to be applied based off the health and safety of the individual. And that's, I think, the one way we were able to get things pushed through our county board really quickly, at least to get immediate funding response, was we painted the picture to our superintendent, sat her down and said, we don't have another option.
No, we didn't.
This is needed.
Okay. Mhm. We haven't typically under our board because our housing comes through the 450 providers I do oversight on, my staff and I. So we do have providers that are in place that do housing. But what I try to do is when we have our providers coming in, there's very specific areas that we have them looking at, because one could be autism and maybe they would like to just take only individuals with autism or medically fragile. But when it comes to human trafficking, I'm really picky about what provider I'm gonna look at for that, because I'm just looking at what's their tolerance for children and victimization. So we do have our own housing that is put in place that just strictly is for all of our DD individuals that have waiver services. But yeah, I think we just had a person who joined our coalition who is from the housing authority, or she deals with housing. And so there's certain people that we can call, so, but it's a very good idea.
So some additional resources, like I had mentioned, Disability Rights Ohio put out a great publication in 2015. They have it accessible through their website online. It gives a little bit more insight onto the prevalence of sexual abuse and sexual exploitation amongst those with developmental disabilities in the state of Ohio. and even provide some very specific examples and cases that have happened in the past as well. There's also health and welfare alerts that come out through the state of Ohio through the MUI department, and they have over the past couple years started putting those out to be more aware of trafficking and exploitation as well, which is fantastic because those are mandatory required forms that all providers across the state of Ohio have to review when they're sent out from the state and sign off for annual compliance. So the more we can get this information and awareness out there, the better off I think we'll be to helping curb this issue and problem. Are there any questions?
What methods do you guys use for individuals who are completely nonverbal? So if you have someone who's not able to express that when something's been able to solve or trafficking?
I haven't experienced it firsthand as far as with trafficking, but on a day-to-day basis, I work with individuals who are nonverbal. So we use PEC systems and picture cards and cue cards like that. Augmentative communication on iPads using kind of like picture communication where it's touch to speak basically. We find ways to empower the person based off their preference. Sometimes us questioning them and getting the gestural prompts from them of yes, no is sometimes as basic as we can get. Or I use my hands a lot of the time, so I'll say, is it this one or this one? And have them point to the hand that it is. So it's just finding a way to connect with the person and how they'll respond, and once you find that, utilize that method. There's always a way to get somebody to communicate. Behavior is communication too. So seeing somebody act abnormally, acting out in ways that are uncommon or ways that may be a little too, I don't know, seductive in their approaches in inappropriate ways, take those as communication. Because just because they can't tell you what's going on, they might be able to show you, act out, or have some negative behavioral consequences that becomes a pattern and trend that if you're doing your job monitoring, you'll know something's up and be able to call what it is or help get to that response of what it is.
And sometimes it could be medical also.
Yeah.
They can have like urinary tract infections that keep coming back and back and back. So, and normally with a nonverbal person, you will probably have a cue that something's not right, so you can get it actually sometimes through doing medical evaluations.
Question?
Pat, I know what we do at the board, but I'm wondering if the coalition has formed maybe a partnership with the Family and Child Abuse Prevention Center to support the integrity of that interview material, to support prosecution.
Oh.
There's a light bulb that just went off.
I know, I didn't
Yeah.
think about that one.
I didn't.
That may be something to help us with guided questioning and responses to be able to then paint that better picture accurately.
Well, I know that from the years of working with children, and that the same communication barriers, and my point of reference and what I understand, you know, and whether they're competent and whether they can, kind of sometimes, you know, impacts the ability to prosecution, and those centers were developed to really support that. But I didn't know if that was a reach out for people with developmental disabilities too.
No, but now it will be, and you're going to be
Yeah.
my point of reference.
Yeah, and the children's department, because with most of we've trained all the SSAs and EIs in our children's department, so they know what to look for. And if they think they might have a case that doesn't look right, they're calling. They know to call the task force on their own. They will call them because they're calling it an MUI at the same time as law enforcement and task force is being involved. So they kind of have a structure that they use. But I was thinking for the other question she had for nonverbals, it's no different than teaching. Like I have a grandson that's 9. He learned that for Xbox, no one touches here, they don't touch here, and they do not touch there. So that's something that's very simple and it can be taught very easily. Because some of the things that you would use for the children, you can use for our actual individuals in order for them to understand it.
Any other questions? Well, thank you guys for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, I left my presenter. Now I'm going back into my moderator mode. Okay, your CU number is 35741. 35741. And thank you all very much.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to the 11:30 session. I'm your room aide and moderator today. My name's Courtney Stewart, representing the Lucas County Human Trafficking Coalition. I have a couple of housekeeping items before we introduce our next speaker. On each of your chairs, you'll find a green evaluation sheet. Grab one next to you, fill it out. You can either turn it over and leave it on your chair when you leave, or you can find myself toward the back of the room and hand it off to me. In your welcome bag, you should have also gotten a blue sheet. This is for your overall conference experience for the day. This will be turned in over by the registration table on your way out for the day. I also have some sign-in clipboards. You'll put your name and your email address on them. I'm going to start one on the left side of the room and one on the right, and I'll have one in the back if it didn't get to you before you leave. And some of these presentations will be uploaded to the website that you can take a look at in October. Okay? So let's introduce our next speaker. Amy Rouleau, BSW MPA, is the founder and director of Restoration Place, a nonprofit organization in Michigan, and she is the author of Human Trafficking 101, Stories, Stats, and Solutions. Her personal testimony as a foster care child and survivor of childhood sexual abuse will leave you inspired. Let's give a welcome to Amy.
I'm a wanderer, so I'm stealing this one. Is this on? Oh, yay. Okay. And my clicker. Hello, everybody. So this thing's a little wonky, so I am kind of heavy, but not as heavy as the stage makes me sound. I'm just saying. Like, okay. If I wasn't insecure before. So I'm so glad you're here. We've been to this conference a few times before, so I've seen a few familiar faces. So it's so great to be back. A few things before I forget. There's some information on that back table over there. Once I get rolling, I get all into it, and I forget that there's stuff. So the book, The Human Trafficking 101, it's available on Amazon. I'm totally out, but you can get it on Amazon. So there's little cards back there for that. Also, a friend of mine, she was here but didn't speak this time around, but Lori Handrahan has this amazing book called Epidemic, and I use it in almost every presentation and seminar that I give. So if you get an opportunity, that too is available on Amazon. There's also little postcards back there with the programs that we run, and a little brochure about Restoration Place. So a few things before we get really into it. So Restoration Place, anybody heard of Restoration Place? One of you, okay. so like many of us, right, our nonprofits are kind of small. They haven't gone quite as widespread as we'd like them to just yet. But it's our main purpose and goal to open up a home for girls who've been sex trafficked or in the foster care system and who've been sexually abused, ages 11 to 17. We have 11 acres out in the middle of nowhere, so a bunch of corn and cows, you know. And we've been fundraising since 2012 to raise about $500,000 to actually build a 6,000 square foot ranch for these girls. In the meantime, Restoration Place has turned into a referral service. So we often get calls from victims, family members, different agencies looking for resources in their area. And those needs range everywhere from I need a detox center, I need transition housing, emergency shelter, all the way to I've been out for 20 years and I need some mental health. So it just really depends on the need. We have also become one of the most active and requested services for human trafficking identification and response training for the state of Michigan. The state of Michigan is currently under a mandate that all healthcare professionals with a license have to have this training before they can relicense in the state of Michigan. So, and under that healthcare umbrella hit all of our massage therapists, physical therapists, dentists, doctors, nurses, all of our mental health. So it's been a really awesome thing to see Michigan take this step forward, but we are very busy. So last year we did 94 seminars. When I say we, I mean me. So it was really busy. But what I want to talk to you today about is the vulnerabilities that are created and those we see targeted most for human trafficking here in the US. That includes those in our foster care system and those who've already been sexually abused. So I'm going to go into my story a little bit. So in 2012, Restoration Place started, but it really began in 2011. So I had just gone through like a really crappy divorce. Not that any of them are good, right? But you don't get divorced for fun. But I found myself I'm like a single mom, these 2 little kids, and I was just burnt out. And I found a flyer for a women's retreat, and I really didn't care what was happening at this women's retreat. I just wanted to get away for the weekend. So I sent my kids off with their dad and myself and 8 of my friends and went way up north in Michigan in February. It was like the coldest weekend ever. So we got up there, and has anybody here been to a women's retreat? Okay, so quite a few of you, probably not the guys, sorry. But if you've never been, it's sort of like camp for big girls, right? Instead of like Elmer's glue and the macaroni necklaces, you've got classes in couponing, right? Quilting. If you want to make a doll to send to Africa, you go to a women's retreat, okay? So I got up there and I made a straight V-line to divorce care, because they were having a breakout session in divorce care, because that's where I was at in my life. Now, the problem was when I got up there, the entire weekend was themed around human trafficking. And I was like, oh, not my issue, right? I was in the middle of my social work program at University of Michigan, and I thought, I kept hearing human trafficking and slavery equated together, and I was like, this is not our problem anymore. We don't have this here. What is everybody freaking out about? And I went to divorce care, I put my stuff down, and something was just egging me back, right? Like, I was like, maybe for cultural competence. Maybe I'll just go back and find out what this is. Maybe I'll see this somewhere in my practice. So I picked up my stuff, and I went back to the main auditorium where the missionary was speaking. And she was talking about what human trafficking really looked like here in the US. And she was talking my life. It was what I knew, I just didn't know it had been defined. I didn't know the language. I didn't know they had laws surrounding this kind of thing. That weekend, my entire life blew up, right? I was in social work because I was like, I'm gonna work with kids, I'm gonna be a counselor, I'm gonna, do this, that, whatever. I don't know if I have any brothers or sisters in the house, but I am a research nerd, okay? So I get a problem, I dive headfirst into research. And that's what I did. I went home and I researched everything I could possibly find on human trafficking, nationally, globally. What does it look like in our schools, our neighborhoods? What are we really talking about here? So through that process, and I continue to research, because research nerds, yeah, we do it daily. But through that first year, what happened was, through a series of steps, I ended up going back to that same retreat center the following year and gave my first presentation on human trafficking identification and response. So we've been doing this now for several years, and it just sort of came full circle, and it has evolved into this amazing program. But what I want to talk to you today about, because I could talk forever, we literally do like 4-hour programs, so I'll condense it for you. I promise lunch is going to be amazing, so I won't keep you from lunch. But I wanted to talk to you about some of the biggest areas when we're talking about our vulnerable population, our at-risk populations. And I'm just going to throw out some numbers to get us started. But there's approximately 2 million children who are missing consistently in the United States. Right? About 2.5 million kids actually run away every year. Right? They put on their little backpack, they head down the street, somebody reports them missing. Most of them end up back home. In the state of Michigan, about 1,000 people are reported missing every week. Most of them end up back home. These are the kids who are consistently gone. A third of these children are called throwaways because no one bothered to report them missing. These are often the children we see show up in emergency shelters, emergency departments, often dead. We don't know who they are, where they've come from. We also know that within the first two days of a child running away, 70% of them are encountered by a child predator. In some time, we're actually seeing this in less time, depending on the situation. So now we've got kids who, 8, 9, 10 years old with access to social media, right? They're like, oh my gosh, I hate my parents, I hate my family, I'm out of here. And they've got someone who has friended them, and they have no idea they're a predator. Give me your address, I'll come pick you up. Their predator, their trafficker, is in the driveway before they even hit the door. We also find that in our northern states especially, in the middle of winter, right? If I'm 14 years old and I just hit the streets and I'm carrying everything I own in a garbage bag, that screams vulnerability, right? Predators are looking for that. Predators know how to spot vulnerability. They know based on how somebody walks, how they talk, how they respond to a question. If they make eye contact, they know within 8 minutes if they've got someone on the hook as a human trafficking victim. It doesn't take much. So some things that we have noticed, some trends that we have noticed with groups who are consistently more vulnerable, and this is not to say that, I mean, anybody can be a trafficking victim and anybody can be a trafficker, right? So we know across the socioeconomic lines and statuses, races, and cultures, we know that. But when we're talking about human trafficking here in the US, we often see these things come into play. More than 60% of those who are trafficked here in the US have experience in the foster care system. More than 91% of those trafficked here in the US have a history of childhood sexual abuse. Those are two of the biggest indicators we look at when we talk about children who are at risk, children who present with vulnerabilities. We also see these things play if they've got experience in homelessness, lack of social safety net, poverty, gender discrimination, criminal activity, immigration status. Again, that history of being abused, right? So the data says 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys. Some of the data, because they don't always agree, some of the data says 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys, depending on who you look up as a resource. Substance abuse and being part of the LGBTQ community. So you can imagine if you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of these things working against you, your vulnerability, your at risk is through the roof. And what happens is every time someone is exploited in this way, every time they're victimized in this way, it creates more risk, it creates more vulnerability, and more opportunity for exploitation. The average lifespan from point of entry is 7 years. 7 years. If a little boy is trafficked at the age of 12, chances are he's not making it to 20. Right? We often see substance abuse, so overdose, murder, suicide, easily treatable, transmittable diseases, taking these kids out early. So I got a call last fall from a friend of mine. We've been friends since we were 10 years old. We were close. We grew up together. We were like sisters. And when I say close, I mean like I was often the getaway driver. We were very close. So she calls me up last fall and she says, "You got to come talk to these girls." She's called mom on the street. For the last 13 years, she had been trafficked out of Detroit. She says, "You got to come talk to them." I've lost 3 of them this year, and the last one was 19 years old. I convinced her to go into rehab. The day she got out, her pimp found her, shot her up with heroin. She died of an overdose. They're not making it very long. The only one who could identify the body was my friend. 19 years old, out of the foster care system, dropped off at the shelter steps when the check stopped coming. She was on the street for probably about 6 months before she died. There was no news story about it. There was no obituary written in the newspaper. Nobody missed this kid. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about, it's kind of fuzzy, it's all good. Tell you a little bit about my story. So I told you about 2011. And the missionary started talking about what human trafficking looked like. And the reason it hit me, because we all know the basic dynamics of human trafficking, you have to have that element of exploitation. That element of trade has to be there for it to be, to go from familial abuse, right, to incest, to trafficking. That element of trade has to be there. The reason that human trafficking hit me so hard was not because that element of trade was there. It wasn't. My father was not taking pictures of me, and he wasn't taking videos and uploading them. He wasn't trading me out to the neighbors. I had become his recruiter. So as far back as my sister and I can kind of recall, early on, he started targeting women, single women with young kids. He targeted my mother because she ran a daycare. He had consistent access to children. She passed away when I was 2. And as soon as she passed away, married her friend who had 5 little kids. When that fell apart, married her friend who had 2 little kids. We were often the drop-in center for the wayward niece who was pregnant, so we had some babies in the house. So by the time I got into middle school, we had 11 children under the age of 12 come in and out of our home. Also by that time, the last stepmother and stepkids had moved out. And my older sister had been kicked out at 17 and ended up in Philadelphia with her own trafficker. So by the time I got into middle school, it was just me and my father. And at that point, I knew exactly how much vodka to drink every night to pass out and still function in school the next day. I had become a functioning alcoholic. School was my safety. And I did really well in school. I put all my energy into school. What happened through those years, though, was I had become his recruiter. It was a constant bring your friends over, bring your friends over, bring your friends over, and I would get rewarded for it. I would get to have pizza that night. I would get to go shopping or have money, or sometimes he was just happy with me that day, and that was enough. So throughout middle school, nobody ever told. So this was, back in the 80s. The word pedophile had just sort of hit the streets. Nobody knew what to do with it. So as far as I knew, nobody had ever said anything. And my reputation was kind of like, we were like, that house in the neighborhood. Like, don't go to their house. You're not allowed to be friends with her. So by the time I got into high school, so this is where all the schools converge into one right now. So now we've got like 1,200 kids running around. I had a new friend because none of my friends had actually stuck around. Right? I would bring them over. I'd get rewarded for it. He'd get us drunk. He would molest my friend, and they weren't my friend anymore. So in high school, I had a new friend. And he said, bring her over, bring her over, bring her over. So I finally caved, and over Christmas break, I brought her over. He got us drunk. He raped her that night. And my reward was we got to go to the bowling alley the next day. He dropped us off at the bowling alley, and she was the first one, the only one who told me really what happened. I knew what happened with the other ones, but nobody ever said anything. She told me, and it wasn't a well-thought-out plan, right? It was just sort of a flash in my head. It's not my story. Because what happened was I'd watched for years and experienced for years the consequences of the family's secret getting out. And I wasn't going to break it wide open. But I thought, you know what? It's not my story. I don't have to tell them about me. So I went to school the following Monday, and I found my school counselor, and I said, hypothetically speaking, what would happen if, right? And I laid out this insane scenario of what happened the weekend before. He knew to take it to the next level, but I didn't know that yet. So the following 2 weeks, there were detectives sitting outside of our house. I went to school. I come home around 3. He left at 4. He worked afternoons, come home around midnight. And all I knew for those 2 weeks was that the secret was out and nothing was happening. And this is where the system fell apart for me. CPS had been out to our house several times before, once for an untreated broken arm. In elementary school, we were starving, so we were stealing lunches from other kids and eating in the bathroom. There were several occasions where a sibling had told, and there were social workers in our house, and he, sort of explained everything away. In fact, my sister had found an old social work report case that said, he neither confirms nor denies, but he's going to church now. We're closing the case. Right. So this time, instead of CPS coming out to the house, he left for work, and I got a phone call from CPS. Said, do you know your father's been arrested today? I said, well, nope. And I said, well, pack a bag and give us a name and number of someone we can call to come pick you up. The only people I was close to were my grandparents on my mother's side, and I hadn't seen them in a really long time. Those years were very isolated for me. And I didn't want them knowing anything about this. It was a very, very shame-filled thing for me. So I gave them a name and number of family friends that we hadn't seen in years, but I knew they were close by in proximity, about 10 minutes away. So I gave them the name and number, and I packed a bag, and my intention was to run. I was like, I'm dead anyway. I'm out. So I packed a bag. The only problem was the only friend that I had that still stuck around was the one that's being trafficked out of Detroit. Right? Her life was no better than mine. And I knew I'd get in more trouble for trying to hide out at her house than if I actually stayed. So I stayed. The friends of the family came and picked me up. The problem was, because of the friends of the family had known him for years and years and years and years and years, even before he married my mother, they couldn't possibly believe that this man who had a good job, lived in a nice home, drove a nice car, right? He was the guy you went to if you needed help with rent, money, food. He went to church, taught Sunday school. They couldn't possibly believe that he had been doing these things. They bailed him out of jail. The following day, he was sitting next to me on their couch telling me that I had ruined his life. And I believed him. I spent the next 8 years trying to make it up to him. I was 22 before I was able to break away from that relationship. Now, those friends and family, they actually became my foster family for the next 2 years. I saw a social worker once who showed up to my school about a week after he had gotten arrested with 6 police officers to grill me about what happened that night, and I completely shut down. My father ended up pleading guilty to a lesser crime. My friend didn't want to tell her story for the 10th time. Right? She had told it over and over and over again. And because she was over the age of 13, the degree of punishment was way less than if she had been under the age of 13. And she thought, well, what was the point? They used that surveillance that they had for those 2 weeks to convict him, and he pled guilty, he said, to save me from testifying against him. So he pled guilty to a lesser charge, which meant he got a year in jail, which is 10 months in jail time. Within 3 months, he was on work release. And because he was promising money to my new foster family, they were driving me up to his work every night to spend his lunch break with them. So I knew there was never going to be any kind of escape. When he got out of jail, he bought a house about 2 blocks down from where we were living. He never ended up on the sex offender registry list. He was off probation on my 18th birthday, which was 6 months before that law went into effect. So anybody off probation before September of 1994 never made it on that list, which is also why I publish everything in Amy Joy. He's still alive. I still teach in my hometown all the time, right? But everything I do down there is in Amy Joy. Well, I guess it would be up here from here. Okay. So that being said, some things unraveled, and we're going to talk about some examples as we go along, but I wanted to give you some color and context of what we're talking about here today. So child abuse and neglect has been linked to impaired brain development, juvenile delinquency, serious injury and death. Other indicators, if you were in here for the one before, developmental disabilities, right? 80+% of those diagnosed with a developmental disability have a history of childhood sexual abuse. That's huge. That's enormous when we go from 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 to 85%. It's insane. Socialization problems, poor school performance, depression, suicide, substance abuse, teen pregnancy, and adult criminality. This is probably my favorite slide of all time, and y'all can have it too. If you just Google, right, brain response and trauma or childhood trauma, it's been used millions and millions and millions of times. So, but what this does so beautifully is it tells us exactly what happens to somebody who has been through trauma, who has endured long-term trauma. So over here on your left, you've got a brain, you've got someone who's walking around, they're making decisions, they're processing new information, right? They're living their day-to-day life fairly well. They're using their prefrontal cortex, their executive decision-making ability. So where you see the red areas is where you see the concentration of activity happening in the brain. Over here, on your right, you've got someone who's been abused over time. And you see these big, massive holes. But most notably, what you see is the red area is concentrated over the survival center of the brain, the primal center of the brain. If I'm in constant survival mode, if I'm in a constant state of searching for safety, if I don't think that I'm going to make it from 1 minute to the next, guess what I'm not doing? I'm not processing new information. I'm not making good decisions. I'm not using my executive functioning. I am living purely out of my survival mode. So to break it down, to explain to you sort of simply, somebody explained it really well, and I use this example every time I go somewhere now too, but let's take, for example, you're walking down the street, you pass a big bush. The ground is not as wobbly as this one. You pass a big bush, right? There's a crackle in the bush. And all of a sudden, giant bear pops out. Your brain instantly goes into fight, flight, or freeze, right? There's a fourth F, the fawn, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So fight, flight, or freeze. And depending on your personality type, you might go into freeze first, you might go into fight or flight first. But what happens is these are 2 different systems. And when your survival mode is triggered, your brain gets flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, with stress hormones, okay? So we call this the gas pedal and the brake. So what's happening with fight or flight, it's the sympathetic nervous system. It gets your body ready to move. Your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure, everything is just ramped up. When you hit the freeze mode, it's the parasympathetic nervous system. Everything calms back down, right? So it decreases your temperature, your respiration, your heart rate, everything. If you stay in freeze for too long, it's called folding or collapse. When you're in folding or collapse, oftentimes people, their internal organs will actually start to shut down and can urinate or defecate on themselves. So let's take, for instance, we've got a giant bear in front of us, right? Our brain instantly, fight, flight, or freeze, two different systems that can't operate together in a way that's actually going to protect you, right? Because you're thinking, can I run away fast enough? Can I play dead? Can I fight the big bear? And we're not logically thinking these things, but our brain is going through these options. To be totally honest, I would probably pee myself, okay? Big bear. Okay, so big bear, I go into folding or collapse, pee myself, and let's say, for instance, big bear goes, oh my gosh, that's so gross, right? And he runs away. We have just survived our first bear attack. Yay! So here's the thing. When we're talking about survival mode, when we're talking about trauma over and over and over again, the next time I go walking down the street and I pass a big bush and there's a crackle in the bush, my brain instantly, bear. It could be a cat, it could be the wind, it could be nothing at all. But my brain is going to go through this process, flooding my system, right? I've got the gas pedal and the brake going on at the same time. You know, if you get in your car and you hit the gas pedal and the brake at the same time, what happens? Okay, it might jerk, but you're not going to go anywhere, right? Okay. And all you're doing is flooding your system with gasoline. You're flooding your engine with gasoline. And that's what's happening to your system with adrenaline and cortisol. Our brain actually becomes damaged through the process of continued trauma. So what happens is if we are triggered, if we're in a moment, everything that we see, hear, touch, feel, taste, all of the sensory information coming into our bodies and our system right now is an implicit memory, right? An unconscious memory. Until our hippocampus, right? There's a little part in the brain, sort of somewhere in the middle. Our hippocampus is largely responsible for integrating memory so that tomorrow when I wake up, I can be like, yep, that stage was really wobbly, right? It can be something that I can recall. So we're getting all this information downloaded into our unconscious, our implicit memory. Our hippocampus has to be online in order for me to wake up tomorrow and remember and tell you about it. When trauma is happening, it shuts down the integrative function of the hippocampus. If you wonder why victims, survivors, whatever you want to call it, cannot tell you their story, whether it's 2 minutes or 20 years later, it's often because even if they get triggered in their environment and they have no idea why, right? They're walking around with PTSD, it's because they're stuck in this implicit memory part, this unconscious memory part. It never got integrated. So what trauma does, when our system is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, it damages the hippocampus. The hippocampus actually shrinks. There's an inability to learn and process new information. And it damages the central nervous system and physical organs. So if you have not read the ACEs study, please read it. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, right? So what they did is a longitudinal study that said, we know that these 10 different categories of adverse childhood experiences, so did mom and dad get a divorce? Did somebody go to prison? Was there alcoholism? Was there physical, sexual abuse? 10 different categories. The more of these you can check off, the more likely you are to end up later on being obese, a smoker, a drinker, having mental health issues, right? Having diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, 6 or more, chances are you're going to die 20 years earlier than your peers. The amygdala, so the smoke detector of the brain, the emotional center of the brain, the amygdala becomes overactive. And what happens when the amygdala becomes overactive is it actually shuts down the language center. If you've ever seen somebody in shock and they cannot tell you what just happened, it's because their language center wasn't working. All of the energy they need for their brain is going straight to survival, They have no words to describe what just happened. And 20, 30, 40 years later, they have no words to describe to you the visuals or the sensations that they have in their body. The prefrontal cortex, the growth is inhibited. We often see this impacting impulse control, learning, problem solving. It's associated with antisocial and aggressive behavior. Now, both male and female experience damage to both of these areas, but it's noteworthy to tell you that to a greater degree, the amygdala is impacted in females. To a greater degree, the prefrontal cortex is impacted in males. So if you're social work, I apologize. You have seen this 1,001 times. But I tell you what, it's the easiest way to explain to a dentist, right? Trauma. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Maslow said back in the 1940s, you know what, we need all of these things just to survive and then to live a healthy, well-balanced, developed life. And you cannot get to the next step on the ladder until you've achieved the one before it. So we need our physical needs met first. We need food, water, sleep, air. We need those things, right? If I'm 14 years old and I just hit the streets and I haven't slept in 3 days, what's my need? Sleep, right? And guess what? I don't give a rip about my safety. I don't care whose couch I'm crashing on. I don't care who's doing crack in the kitchen. I need my physical needs met first. I need to survive. When my physical needs are met, now we're looking for safety, right? Physical, emotional, and mental safety. If I am 9 years old and I'm sitting in a classroom and I know logically my teacher's safe, she's cool, we're all good. I know these kids are my friends, awesome. I know physically, I'm safe. But every little noise from the hallway makes me think my abuser's coming through the door. I don't give a rip what 2 + 2 is. I'm not going to process new information. Once we have our safety needs met, then we're looking for love and belonging. Family, friends, social groups, and I got to tell you, if you're not getting it from healthy places, you're getting it from unhealthy ones. Same with our kids, right? Because we need this to survive. We were created and designed for connectedness, for relationship. We have to have it. It's necessary. There's another component to this, attachment, but we do not have time for that today. Something amazing to look up, though, on your own. So love and belonging, and then esteem. I'm accepted, I'm respected, I'm valued by others. And then self-actualization, right? I wake up in the morning with a purpose. I know who I am, I'm grounded in self, it's all good. And most days, we bounce between these things all the livelong day, right? So some days I wake up and I'm like, oh my gosh, you're crap. And we gotta start all over, right? Or some days I wake up and I'm like, I need coffee, and my daughter's not gonna survive, right? So we gotta start over. What happens with those who've been trafficked, those who've been traumatized over time, is they consistently sit here. Whether they're 6 or 60, they sit here in a constant state of searching for safety. What we often see with those coming out of trafficking or long-term abuse are these diagnoses. So CPTSD, so not just PTSD from a one occurring incident. When we talk about CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, we're talking about trauma over trauma over trauma over trauma. And if you're being raped 6 to 10 times a night, that's a whole lot of trauma. It's a lot of trauma. It requires a different therapeutic approach. Anxiety, depression, not your typical feeling crappy for the day, right? We often see substance abuse, eating disorder, self-harm, suicidal ideation going along with these things. Stockholm Syndrome, or what we now modernly call trauma bonds. If you say it too fast, it sounds like a candy bar, so I have to slow down. Trauma bonds. So what trauma bonds and Stockholm Syndrome is, it's a deep psychological, emotional attachment to one's abuser, trafficker, captor. And it exists on a spectrum to, I kind of feel bad for this person today, to I will rob a bank and die for this person today. We often see this as one of the biggest barriers in our court systems, where we've got victims who are so psychologically, emotionally attached to their abuser that they won't testify. This one still kind of gets me some days. Some days I still wake up believing that old lie that I ruined his life, and I kind of feel bad for him. Then I call my therapist and we readjust. We're okay. So yeah, I'm in a lot of therapy. It's okay. And I'm of the firm belief, if you are a social worker, you best have a social worker. If you're any kind of mental health, if you're in this field, you better have a mental health professional to process all this stuff through with. And then dissociation. So dissociation also exists on a spectrum. So we all dissociate. If you've ever been driving in your car and you have missed your turn because you were off swimming somewhere in Hawaii in your brain, right? You have dissociated. All the way to derealization, so not feeling like the world around you is quite real, feeling like it's distorted. Depersonalization, so the actual separation from the mind, the psyche, from the physical body. We often find depersonalization and the freeze response largely responsible for what happens next, dissociative identity disorder. Anybody know what that used to be called? Very good. Multiple personality disorder. So they relabeled it because it was getting a bad rap, right? Sybil. Okay. So, yeah. But it was the multiple personality, and it still gets a bad rap, you know, because the latest one was what, Split? Oh, that's a horrible movie. But I got to tell you, if there were 3.5 million people running around the U.S. murdering their therapists, people would pay attention. When people have dissociative identity disorder, it does not mean that this disorder has created mayhem or chaos or an inability to function. Anybody know anybody with dissociative identity disorder? So a few of you, awesome. Now the rest of you do, right? So growing up during childhood, I was actually able, it's a survival technique, right? So while trauma is happening, in the moment, your brain is actually able to take on the trauma in that moment and stuff it away. And sometimes that trauma over time develops its own name, its own likes, dislikes, hobbies, allergies, illnesses. Oftentimes, those parts, or what we clinically call alters, get stuck at an age where the trauma occurred. And it's not until there is a place of safety that people actually get diagnosed with DID. Because it's not until those parts feel safe enough to emerge that we understand what this really is. People who were previously diagnosed with bipolar, borderline personality, mood disorders, schizophrenia, right? Because they often have some of the same symptoms. But DID is different in the way that it actually creates very distinct personalities. So, and I always like to tell people my parts, we all have parts of ourselves, right? Mine just have really well-formed boundaries, and they don't talk to each other very well. But what happens is oftentimes, I'm not going to read all of these to you. The slides will be available after, whenever they put them up on the website, but we don't have time for everything. But I wanted to talk to you about memory. So those who have DID often have significant memory loss during childhood. Those are generally the years that trauma is occurring and those parts are developing. They also have what's called dissociative amnesia. So when alters or parts, right, jump into the driver's seat, take over the mind and the body, there can be times, whether it's a day, an hour, a month, sometimes a year, where an entirely different part took over and the core part comes back and has no recollection of what happened. Oftentimes we see memory issues because of dissociative amnesia, especially if you're in a place where there's a lot of people not remembering names. So even if you've known somebody for 15 years, right, and you're kind of like, they might look familiar. I used to think it was an age thing, but I'm like, I'm not that damn old. So I'm like, we're not there yet. So memory issues. And there are some people where the parts actually come in, they take over the entire body, and they do their thing. And then there are some people like me who are co-conscious. So I actually, as the core part, will stay present, but it's sort of like stepping behind a foggy glass, and the parts come forward. I can hear and experience, and I know everything that's going on, but I have little or no control over it. I found this to be really, really awesome, because when we talk about DID, we often talk about splits, broken pieces, right? Splitting off. But this, you are not broken. Your mind did not collapse and shatter to pieces under the weight of your trauma like rubble or cracks in the concrete. It was a castle built in violent storms, its glorious thick pillars reinforcing each floor with new strength. Together they held you up. I I thought, how beautiful to describe something that kept so many people alive and out of mental institutions. Okay, so signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. You guys know a lot of this stuff. Flashbacks, whether it's in the mind or the body. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, great reference for body memory. I'm not going to go through all of these things, easy startle response, just because we're going to run out of time and I want to get to the fun stuff. Okay, so Stockholm Syndrome, we already talked about a little bit. Symptoms of depression, you guys know this stuff. Feeling empty, persistently sad, not interested in the things you used to do. There we go. So signs of past or current abuse, things to watch out for. So bedwetting or other accidents that are not age appropriate or medically explained. When I was 6, 7, 8 years old, if I could hear my father's voice, but I couldn't see him, it was an instant go for me. We worked with a young lady, 18 years old, in the foster care system. She kept urinating down her heat vent at night because she was terrified to leave her room. We often find that the younger they are when the abuse starts, the more this is an issue, and it often will follow them into adolescence and adulthood. Frequent or severe headaches or stomach aches. So we often see psychosomatic symptoms, right? So backaches, headaches, stomach aches. So we often, as adults, we're like, I've got IBS, I have migraines, I have severe back pain. In a kid, it's going to be my tummy hurts, my head hurts, I don't feel good. So withholding stools, hypervigilance, inability to sleep, overly reclusive or submissive. This can sometimes become actually part of the personality, especially if you're growing up in a home where the abuse is occurring and it's your primary goal to be invisible, to not be seen, not be heard. Being overly reclusive in any setting just becomes part of who you are. Anticipating others' needs, especially adults. Right? I wiped off all the tables for you. I emptied the dishwasher. I vacuumed the floor. Can I grade those papers for you? Can I pour you a cup of coffee? I said that. So sexual aggression towards younger children, sexual activities with peers. Okay. If you've got two 17-year-olds, kind of goes with the territory, right? So age, stage, and situation. But if you've got a 9-year-old interested in having sex with a 6-year-old, or a 15-year-old interested in having sex with a 9-year-old, pay attention to those things. Coming to school or other activities early and not wanting to go home, right? So oftentimes, I don't know if they still call it latchkey, but I was a latchkey kid. So through 3rd grade, I could actually walk to school. And I got there when the janitor unlocked the door, and I left when he kicked me out, right? So wanting to be anywhere but where it was happening. Not receiving attention for physical problems have been brought to a caregiver's attention. So oftentimes we see, of course, they're not going to have a pimp party. A bunch of pimps get together and beat the crap out of somebody, and then, oh, let's take them to the doctor. That generally does not happen. Yes, many of them see medical professionals, but for the most part, they're not being injured and then taken care of by the same person who just injured them. So I told you about the untreated broken arm. When I was 13, the summer before my father got arrested, I jumped out of the back of a pickup truck and I popped my hip out of place. And he popped it back in. And I spent the next couple of weeks pretty drugged up, just waiting for school to start, because at that time, we were very isolated. Nobody was coming in to check in on us and see how things were going, and we did not go to the emergency room or the doctor or the dentist unless we were severely broken or nearly dead. That was the rule. Common diagnosis that we see in children with a history of trauma. This does not mean that all kids with these diagnoses have a history of trauma. It does mean that it should trigger you to ask the following questions when you do a history trauma assessment, right? So kids who've been diagnosed with ADHD, with or without the H. Autism spectrum, again, due to the dissociative behaviors, being nonverbal, right, that Broca's area, shut down. What we're finding now is kids, when they're entering school for kindergarten and who are nonverbal, diagnosed with autism, it doesn't take long before they start speaking, because those first 5 years, that area of the brain didn't develop as it should because the trauma was occurring. Parallel play, so not engaging with play with peers, but playing next to them. So spacing out, numbing, not feeling physical pain. I was often the daydreamer in the classroom, right? I remember every single window from every grade. I remember everything that was outside of those windows. That was it. Oppositional defiant disorder, reactive attachment, emotional impairment, learning disabilities, cognitive impairments. So we could add onto this list all the livelong day. We could. because it's no wonder we see this list when we saw a brain that we saw earlier. This is not to say, again, those diagnosed with this have a history of trauma, but if you don't figure out what it is, I tell you, medication doesn't touch trauma. Medication might help some symptoms, but if you've got kids bouncing from one med to the next, to the next, to the next, you better make sure it's not a trauma issue. Because trauma impacts the brain differently than a chemical imbalance. If a chemical imbalance causes one of these things, medication's probably the way to go. But if it's trauma, it's a whole different approach. So this is probably my favorite quote recently. As the twig is bent, so grows the tree. And what this simply means, when I read it, what it meant to me was we're all born into a family, a culture, a society, a school system, a neighborhood, a country, and all of those things are input. All of those things sort of dictate and guide our experience here on this planet. Are we going to be a doctor? Are we going to be a social worker? Are we going to be a plumber? Are we going to work on a farm? And unless somebody comes along to interrupt the path you started on, you don't know any different. You're just going to continue down the path you started. When I was 10 years old, my friend and I, we found each other. We were headed down the same path. But something happened when I was 16. When I went into the foster care system, the alcohol stopped, and I found the nearest drug dealer. I spent the next several years using drugs, and by the time I was 16, my foster family kicked me out. I finally ended up with my grandparents, which is probably where I should have been the whole time. But for the first time, I was immersed in love, art, music, gardening, right? All the things we know are therapeutic, we just didn't know they were therapeutic at the time. My life started to change, not drastically, not overnight. It wasn't a, 180. I still kept doing drugs. But over time, when I was presented with choices, I knew they were actually choices. I knew my life could look differently than what it had. I knew my life can look differently than my friends. I knew my life could look like my grandparents. My friend didn't have that. And our lives started to go in different directions. July 11th of this year, my friend Sarah OD'd. Sorry, I don't cry. Okay. 33 years we were together. But the only difference was that I had someone come alongside. The one determining factor between if a child in foster care is going to end up in prison or in college is one healthy relationship for their lifetime. It's all it takes. One healthy relationship. Somebody's got to care about these kids. I thought you just needed a happy picture for a minute. Like, okay. Makes me miss my little kitties. I've been divorced, but not quite long enough to justify the amount of cats I have. So we're buying in bulk now. I show up on the buy one, get one free days. So, woo, okay. All right, bye, Mr. Kitty. Okay, so on to the fun stuff. So you're thinking, oh my gosh, when medication doesn't work, what does? Right? These things work. These are the things that have been proven to work by all the big gurus in the area of mental health right now, right? So Bessel van der Kolk, Daniel Siegel, Peter Levine, all these guys say the same thing. Now, I have to give a little caveat here. You better make sure, if it's you who's diving into this, or you're recommending that somebody dive into this, that they have a mental health professional waiting in the wings to process it through with. Because when this stuff starts working, your mama ain't gonna cut it. Right? Talking to your best friend is going to kill your relationship, okay? Make sure you've got somebody skilled in the area of processing trauma to help you through these things. Not that you shouldn't do these things anyway, but if you're doing these things for the purpose of trauma therapy, make sure you've got someone to process it through with. So the big dudes say therapeutic and restorative yoga. Do I have any yogis in here? Ooh, quite a few of you, right? So I get interested in yoga like twice a month when I buy new pants. like, yeah, tomorrow's the day. So it's always on my list, but I'm a giant nerd, so I end up working. But I hear it's wonderful. So expressive arts, we'll go through each one of these just a tiny little bit. So that's your art, music, drama, expressive writing, mindfulness, and sensory-based practices. So when it comes to restorative or therapeutic yoga, it actually boosts the immune function. It gives you an option to actually restore the mind-body balance, because those who've been through trauma often dissociate, right? So they walk around feeling like floating heads. They don't often know the space they take up in a room, what their hand is doing from their leg or their foot, that kind of thing. Restorative yoga is a little different from regular yoga because your instructor is well-versed in trauma. So oftentimes they will not suggest you get into certain positions. You know, if you've got 20 victims of sex trafficking and happy baby pose, not a good thing, right? They also know how to like not line you up so you're looking at everybody else's fanny or somebody's looking at yours. So there's some different approaches with this, with therapeutic and restorative yoga. So expressive therapies, art, music, drama, expressive writing, all of these things, again, they promote expression, imagination, active participation, and reconnect that mind and body. So if somebody asks me, how did it feel to paint that? How does it feel to look at it now? Now, all of a sudden, what can I do? I can assign a feeling, an emotion with a word. Because for a long time, we're walking around with these two halves of the brain not very well connected. When I can start to tell you my feelings through words, when I can start to put language to what I see and feel, I can start to tell you my story. And when I can start to tell you my story, my narrative, that's when healing starts. Not through medication, but through telling my story. So this is what happens when we're in a safe place. The next time we go walking down the street and we're triggered into that survival mode, right? And our brain is like, whoa. It's on fire with survival mode. Instead of going into that PTSD response, that implicit or unconscious response, that now that my hippocampus is online, now that it's working, because guess what? I'm in a safe place. Now, I can tell you, I can recall, and instead of, I'm 4 years old and I'm being raped and it's 1980. Right now, at this very moment, I feel it, I smell it, I hear it, I know it. Now I can tell you, that happened to me then. He smelled like this then. It was in this room. This is what happened in 1980, but I know it is 2019. I'm standing here in a room in front of a bunch of awesome people. What this does is it gives me, finally, time, space, and person orientation. And it takes me out of that PTSD mode. It takes time, it takes relationship. The thing I tell my clients, my students, everybody I teach, if there's only one thing to take away from what I'm saying, is that human trafficking happens through the context of relationship, and healing happens through the context of relationship. You cannot do it in a vacuum. So mindfulness and sensory-based practices, having grounding techniques. So I don't know if you noticed, but I'm kind of a hippie. But I don't wear shoes. So they make me fall down. But what it does is it also grounds me, literally. And I feel centered. I also always have an aromatherapy necklace with me, so I can sort of sniff my way back to the present. I have a very special rock in my back pocket. Right? So there are certain things that we can do to bring ourselves back to present. So all of these things, rocks, paper clips, gum, going barefoot, aromatherapy, tossing a ball, meditation. So breathing techniques, I'm trying to breeze through because we're running out of time. Breathing techniques, this can be triggering for somebody who has never noticed that they actually breathed before. So just keep that in mind if you're like, well, just breathe. They may have never noticed that they could. One thing to note about breathing techniques, there's no real scientific, you don't have to do 4, 7, 8. You can do, as long as you're breathing out for more than you're breathing in. That's it. You can do 4, 5. You can do 3, 6. Right? So breathing in and breathing out. So if you breathe in for 4, breathe out for 8, you're calming your body back down. So aromatherapy, if you're in a clinical setting, be careful before you fill a room with a certain scent. If you've got a victim who's walking in and her father sprayed lavender on her pillow every night before he raped her. That's a really bad scent for her. If you're dealing with people who've been through satanic ritual abuse, they have high holidays, same time we have holidays. Smell of cinnamon, smell of sage, right? The smell of sandalwood, cologne. Be careful before you fill a room with a certain scent. But for personal use, it's great. Animal-assisted therapy, we're often seeing this more and more in courtroom settings, therapeutic settings, schoolrooms. It's a whole lot less threatening to build a relationship with something that is not human. If I go home and tell my kitties all my secrets, they're not going to tell anybody else. And it also increases motivation to participate in therapy. People ask me all the time, why don't you bring a service dog, a therapy dog to your seminars? I'm like, nobody would ever hear me, right? Once you have a dog in the room, nothing else is happening. So it works. I just thought you needed a happy picture. Isn't he cute? Probably my favorite one. So preventing human trafficking, it's done through education. Exactly what we're doing over these past 2 days, educate, 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 right? We can't address what we don't know. Early intervention, knowing the signs. You are not first responders because you're part of the mental health, the education setting, the whatever profession you're in. You're a first responder because you're human. Human trafficking is a human issue. The end, you're a first responder. Developing an in-house protocol, using assessment questions, you can get those off Polaris Project. Using HIPAA compliance, make sure you look that up in your area. And then empowerment programs. Confidence creates greater safety. If we can teach kids younger and younger and younger how to walk, talk, how to make eye contact, give a handshake, how to say no and stick with their no, you ward off those vulnerabilities before they even set in. They've got nothing to pick out. Again, I put this up on all my stuff, 911, the National Human Trafficking Hotline number. If you don't already have this on your phone, my goodness, you should, okay? We're on day 2. This should be like all over the place. And then Polaris Project, I always tell my people, go here, click on the Get Assistance. It'll bring up a map of the United States, and you click on the resources. Again, the book is on Amazon. The resources are back there. We have programs that I think we're going to start collaborating too with Ohio medical community to actually establish training here in Ohio for all of your healthcare professionals as well. So if you want training here, we do that, and we do a ton of on-site seminars. That's all I got for you. So thank you very much. Thank you. I guess I could ask for questions. Oh yeah, there's like questions. I'm like, oh yeah. Anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So, you were talking about the signs of health. Did those signs happen if you were not, I want to say not abuse or a separate person in the abuse. So, like, you and your sister were abused, and he only touched you,
Yes.
but she was there.
Okay. So yeah. So the question is sort of secondary abuse, right? So we've got sort of abused by proxy, if you will. But a great example is my kids. My kids display trauma. They display signs of abuse. They display symptoms because I raised them. Right? Not because that they went through it, but because I was raised with disorganized attachment. So my abuser was also the one I was supposed to get my love and attention and affection from, right? So that's disorganized. I raised my kids with this anxious attachment. I was constantly over them, but I raised them as if they were going to be abused. And they display signs and symptoms. They display vulnerabilities to predators, even though they weren't. So absolutely, and we often find it generational because of that. Even if we think we've stopped it, if we've raised our kids in a way that we didn't recognize we were raising them that way, then it often continues. So yeah, great question, thank you. Any other questions? Okay. I love y'all, you're amazing. Go have fun, go eat something.
Thank you, everyone. We have a CEU code for those that are going to get continuing ed. It is 26159. 26159. Thank you.